The year is 1692, and a cold fear is settling over the small, isolated Puritan villages of New England. It's a fear that whispers in the dark of the dense forests surrounding them, a fear that finds a home in the rigid pews of their meeting houses. They believe the devil is in their midst, walking among them, recruiting souls for his war against God. And by the time this fever of paranoia breaks, the landscape of colonial America will be forever scarred. Over 200 people, from respected church-going matriarchs to homeless vagrants, would be formally accused of witchcraft. 19 men and women would be hanged on the barren crest of Gallows Hill, their bodies cast into a shallow, unmarked grave. Another man, an elderly farmer named Giles Corey, would be pressed to death under heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. At least 5 more would perish in the squalor and disease of the colonial jails, their names damned for a crime that never existed. But who was the real monster in Salem? How did a devout community, built on the bedrock of unshakable faith and a rigid moral code, descend into a murderous hysteria that turned neighbor against neighbor? How did spectral evidence, the absurd, unprovable testimony of afflicted girls claiming to be tormented by the spirits of the accused, become the basis for capital punishment? What combination of genuine belief, social anxiety, and cynical opportunism could convince judges, juries, and ministers to send their own people to the gallows based on the fevered dreams of children? The chilling truth of the Salem Witch Trials is not about a pact with Satan, but about a far more insidious evil, the one that lurks within the human heart when fear is allowed to conquer reason. This is the story of how a perfect storm of religious fanaticism, simmering social tensions, and a catastrophic failure of justice ignited one of the darkest chapters in American history. We will investigate the crippling pressures of frontier life, where the constant threat of war and starvation made the devil feel like a very real and present danger. We will dissect the suffocating Puritan worldview, a theology that saw no difference between a crop failure and a divine punishment, between a personal grudge and a satanic plot. Finally, we will step into the courtroom itself, to witness the sham trials where logic was abandoned and accusation alone was treated as proof of guilt, creating a legal nightmare from which innocence was no defense. This is the anatomy of a witch hunt. To understand the madness that would consume Salem, you must first understand the world they lived in. This wasn't a world of reason and enlightenment, it was a world of crushing fear, a brittle society trapped between a hostile wilderness and an unforgiving God. Before the first accusation was ever whispered, Salem Village was a powder keg, primed with paranoia and resentment, just waiting for a spark to set it ablaze. This is the story of how that powder keg was built. The year is 1692, but the world of Salem Village felt ancient, biblical. Its people were Puritans, a people who had crossed an ocean not for wealth, but to build a perfect city of God in a land they called the Devil's Territory. And to them, this was not a metaphor. The vast, dark forests that pressed in on their tiny settlement were not just trees. They were the literal home of Satan and his demonic legions. Every shadow could hide a fiend. Every rustle of leaves could be the devil himself walking the earth. This wasn't a belief. It was a fact of life, as real as the freezing winter snow and the back-breaking summer heat. Their lives were a constant, desperate battle for survival, fought on 2 fronts. The first was physical. The memory of King Philip's War, just 15 years earlier, was a fresh and bleeding scar. Refugees from that brutal conflict, people who had watched their homes burn and their families slaughtered by Native American tribes, had settled in and around Salem. They brought with them tales of unimaginable violence, stories that fueled a deep-seated terror of the wilderness and the heathen savages who lived within it. Every night, as they barred their doors, they feared not just the cold, but the possibility of a raid, of waking to the screams of their neighbors and the smell of their own homes burning. But the second front was far more terrifying because it was invisible. This was the spiritual war. For a Puritan, God was not a comforting presence. He was a stern, inscrutable judge who demanded absolute perfection and offered salvation only to a chosen few, and you could never be entirely sure you were one of them. The devil, on the other hand, was an active, intimate presence in their daily lives. He wasn't some distant concept of evil. He was a tempter, a schemer, a physical being who could poison your livestock, blight your crops, and steal the souls of your children. Misfortune was never random. A cow that sickened and died, a batch of butter that wouldn't churn, a child that wasted away from fever, these were not tragedies. They were messages, judgments from an angry God, or worse, attacks from an ever-present Satan. Their world was a landscape of divine signs and demonic omens, and they spent their lives desperately trying to read them, living in a state of constant, gnawing anxiety. Into this crucible of fear, you pour the poison of social strife. Salem Village was not a happy, unified community. It was a place seething with bitterness. For decades, the poor, agrarian farmers of Salem Village had been locked in a bitter struggle with the wealthy, cosmopolitan merchants of the nearby Salem town. The villagers felt looked down upon, exploited, and politically powerless. They fought for years just to establish their own church separate from the one in town, a desperate bid for identity and autonomy. But even this victory brought no peace. The village itself was split into warring factions, powerful families like the Putnams and the Porters feuding over land, property lines, and church politics. Neighbor suspected neighbor. Old grudges festered for generations. The village church, which should have been a source of unity, became a battleground, cycling through ministers who were quickly driven out by the endless bickering and accusations. This was a community eating itself alive from the inside out. And as if this weren't enough, their entire world was collapsing. In 1684, the King of England revoked the Massachusetts Bay Colony's charter, the very document that had given the Puritans the right to govern themselves. Overnight, their laws, their land titles, their entire city on a hill was rendered illegitimate. A new royal governor was installed who they despised, and their sense of divine mission was replaced by a sense of profound uncertainty and dread. They felt abandoned by their king, and many feared they were being abandoned by their God. They were a people unmoored from their own identity, adrift in a sea of political chaos. This was Salem Village in 1692, a traumatized community, terrified of the world outside their fences and the devil they believed was already inside them. A society fractured by jealousy, ripped apart by family feuds, and spiritually adrift without a charter or a sense of divine purpose. They were isolated, paranoid, and profoundly stressed. They were looking for an explanation for their suffering. They were looking for an enemy to blame. And in the dead of winter, in the cramped and smoky kitchen of the village minister, a group of young girls would give them one. The year is 1692. The place is Salem Village, a small, isolated Puritan settlement clawing its existence from the harsh soil of Colonial Massachusetts. The world for these people was a small, tightly wound thing, a constant battle between God's grace and Satan's temptations. And in the dead of winter, when the landscape was a frozen monochrome of white snow and black trees, that battle felt terrifyingly close. The devil, they believed, was not some abstract concept. He was real, a physical presence who could walk among them, seeking any crack in their piety, any soul he could twist to his dark purpose. In the biting cold of February, inside the home of the village minister, Reverend Samuel Parris, that crack began to show. It started not with a bang, but with a shudder. In the heart of the Parris household, two young girls, the minister's 9-year-old daughter Betty and his 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams, began to act strangely. At first, it was just listlessness, a vacant stare. But soon, their behavior escalated into something truly terrifying. They would fall into violent, writhing fits, their limbs contorting into impossible angles. They would scream as if in agony, complaining of being pinched, pricked, and bitten by invisible specters. They would crawl under furniture, barking like dogs, their bodies convulsing in an unholy ballet of terror. For the Puritans of Salem, this was not sickness as we understand it. This was an assault, a spiritual invasion made manifest in the flesh of their children. What dark power could twist innocent girls into such grotesque shapes? The frightened community looked for an answer, and their gaze soon fell upon one of the most vulnerable members of the Parris household, Tituba. She was Reverend Parris's enslaved servant, a woman from the Caribbean, likely of Arawak or Carib descent, not African as later myths would claim. In the bleak, rigid world of Puritan New England, Tituba was a splash of forbidden color. She brought with her stories of her homeland, tales filled with magic, spirits, and folklore that were utterly alien to the Puritan mind. To the bored and constrained girls of the village, including Betty and Abigail, these stories were a secret, thrilling escape. Accounts suggest Tituba would sometimes entertain the girls with simple forms of folk magic, like dropping an egg white into a glass of water to divine the profession of a future husband. A common English folk tradition, but one that bordered on sorcery in the eyes of the ministry. One desperate neighbor even had Tituba bake a witch cake, a grotesque concoction of rye meal mixed with the afflicted girl's urine. The cake was fed to a dog, in the belief that the animal would then lead them to the witch responsible for the girl's torment. This act, meant to identify the source of the evil, instead became proof of its existence. It was an admission that they were dealing with witchcraft. As the girls' fits grew worse, spreading like a contagion to other young women in the village, panic mounted. The local physician, William Griggs, was called in. He examined the girls, found no physical ailment, no fever, no sign of disease he could recognize. Faced with the inexplicable, he fell back on the only diagnosis that made sense within his worldview. His chilling verdict echoed through the village like a death knell. The evil hand is upon them. It wasn't just a folk belief anymore. It was a medical diagnosis. The village now had official, authoritative confirmation that they were under attack by the forces of darkness. With this validation, the pressure on Betty and Abigail to name their tormentors became unbearable. Imagine the scene. Two young girls, already in a state of genuine distress, possibly psychological, possibly feigned, surrounded by grave-faced ministers, magistrates, and their own terrified parents. Day after day, they were interrogated. Who is doing this to you? Who is sending their specter to pinch and choke you? What shape does the devil take when he comes for you? The questions were relentless, leading, and filled with the absolute certainty that a witch was to blame. For the girls, caught in a storm of fear and attention they couldn't control, there was only one way out. They had to give them a name. Finally, they did. On February 29th, the afflicted girls leveled their first accusations. They named three women who, in the rigid social calculus of Salem Village, were the perfect targets. The first was Tituba herself. She was the obvious choice. An enslaved woman, a cultural and racial outsider, a practitioner of strange folk traditions. She had no power, no one to speak for her. She was the seed from which the town's paranoia had sprouted. The second was Sarah Good. Good was a homeless beggar, a woman reduced to wandering from house to house pleading for food. She was foul-tempered and known to mutter under her breath when turned away, curses that villagers now reinterpreted as malevolent spells. She was a social deviant who lived outside the bounds of Puritan propriety, a constant, unpleasant reminder of poverty and failure. She was easy to fear and even easier to hate. The third was Sarah Osborne, an elderly, bedridden woman who had been embroiled in a bitter legal dispute over her deceased husband's estate. She had violated social norms by attempting to seize control of the inheritance for herself and her new husband, away from the sons of her first marriage. She was known to be cantankerous and had not attended church in over a year, a serious offense in a community where church attendance was both a civic and religious duty. She had powerful enemies, including the influential Putnam family, and a reputation for being contentious. Look closely at these first three accused: an enslaved woman of color, a destitute beggar, and an unpopular old widow. None of them were wives of powerful men, none of them had social standing. They were the outliers, the unwanted, the thorns in the side of Salem's fragile social order. Their accusation wasn't a random shot in the dark. It was a calculated strike against the most defenseless members of the community. This wasn't yet a hunt for the devil. It was a purging of the undesirable. The spark had been struck. The kindling was dry. And now, with three powerless women in chains, the entire village waited to see if Tituba, under the crushing weight of interrogation, would provide the confession that would turn this spark into an inferno. With the jails of Essex County overflowing with accused witches, the colonial government faced a crisis of its own making. The local magistrates had done their job with terrifying efficiency, extracting confessions and accusations that now implicated dozens of citizens. But they lacked the authority to conduct felony trials. The colony, operating under a new charter from England, was in legal limbo. Into this vacuum stepped Governor William Phips, a man more comfortable on the deck of a ship than in the halls of government. On May 27, 1692, he signed an order creating a special court to handle the witchcraft cases. It was given a formal, ominous name: the Court of Oyer and Terminer, a Norman French legal term meaning to hear and to determine. Its purpose was simple: empty the jails and purge the land of Satan's influence. At its head sat Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton, and if one man can be called the architect of the Salem tragedy, it was him. Stoughton was not a lawyer. He was a theologian, a graduate of Harvard, and a man of rigid, unbending Puritan conviction. He saw the devil's hand in every shadow, and believed with absolute certainty that New England was the front line in a cosmic war between God and Satan. He was not there to preside over a court of law. He was there to command a military tribunal in a spiritual war. He saw the accused not as citizens with rights, but as enemy combatants who had already forfeited their souls. His mind was made up before the first gavel fell. He was not seeking justice, he was seeking victory. But this court would not operate on normal rules of evidence. To deal with a supernatural crime, Stoughton and his fellow magistrates decided they needed a supernatural form of proof. They would legitimize a concept so bizarre, so terrifyingly unjust, that it effectively guaranteed death sentences. It was called spectral evidence. The logic was as simple as it was insane. A witch could send their specter, their spirit shape, out into the world to harm others, all while their physical body remained somewhere else entirely. This meant the afflicted girls could claim that a woman's specter was pinching them, choking them, or forcing them to sign the devil's book, even if the accused woman was miles away, locked in a jail cell. It was the testimony of ghosts, whispered into the ears of the afflicted. And in the court of Oyer and Terminer, this ghostly testimony was considered hard fact. How could an accused person defend themselves against such a charge? How do you prove where your spirit wasn't? You can't. There is no alibi for your soul. It was an unfalsifiable accusation, a prosecutor's dream, and a defendant's worst nightmare. By accepting spectral evidence, Stoughton had loaded the dice so completely that the outcome of every trial was preordained. The court was no longer a place of judgment. It was a stage for a theater of the macabre, and the afflicted girls were its star performers. The first to face this legal inferno was Bridget Bishop. She was, in many ways, the perfect target. She was an older woman, on her third husband, who had a reputation for being argumentative and worldly. She wore a striking red bodice, a splash of color in a world of Puritan gray, which alone was enough to draw suspicion. She owned and ran a tavern, a place associated with drinking, gambling, and idle behavior. Worse still, she had been accused of witchcraft once before, years earlier, though the charges were dropped. The mud from that old accusation had never truly washed away. Her examination on June 2nd was a circus of hysterical accusation. As soon as she entered the Salem Village meeting house, the afflicted girls fell to the floor, writhing and screaming as if struck by an invisible force. When she looked at them, they claimed to be tortured. If she bit her lip, they shrieked that she was biting them. If she nervously wrung her hands, they cried out that their own bones were being broken. Every move she made, every involuntary gesture, was twisted into an act of demonic assault. Her bewilderment and fear were presented as the cold cunning of a practiced witch. Men came forward to testify that she had sent her specter to them years ago, that she had bewitched their livestock, that objects in her old house moved on their own. 2 men who had been hired to do construction on her home swore they had found poppets, small dolls stuck with pins, hidden in the walls, a classic tool of malefic magic. Bridget Bishop denied everything, her voice ringing with defiance. "I am innocent," she declared to the court. "I know nothing of it." When the magistrates asked how she could explain the girl's fits, she gave a simple, logical answer that was, in this court, heresy. "I am innocent to a witch. I know not what a witch is." The magistrates scoffed. Her denial was simply proof of her allegiance to the father of lies. Based almost entirely on the spectral torment of the girls, the jury found her guilty. On June 10, 1692, Bridget Bishop was taken by cart to a barren, rocky hill outside of town that would soon be known as Gallows Hill. There, she was hanged. She maintained her innocence to the very end, a stubborn, defiant woman swallowed by a storm of superstition. Her death was meant to be a warning. It was meant to break the will of the other accused and show the power of the court. Instead, it was gasoline on a fire. It proved to the people of Salem that the court was serious, that witches were real, and that the hangman's rope was waiting for them. With Bishop's execution, the court had created a perfect, inescapable machine for generating guilt. The accused were now trapped in a horrific catch-22. If you were accused and maintained your innocence, as Bridget Bishop did, you were seen as defiant and unrepentant. You were in league with Satan, and your spectral testimony would be used to convict you. You would hang. Deny the charge, and you were a liar in league with the father of lies, destined for the gallows. Confess, however, and you might be saved. The Puritan worldview held that a true confession, a full unburdening of the soul, was the first step toward redemption. The court, therefore, would not execute a confessing witch. To do so would be to rob God of a potentially repentant soul. And so a terrible bargain was offered. Confess to witchcraft, to signing the devil's book, to communing with evil spirits, and your life would be spared. But the price of that life was steep. You would be a social pariah, your name forever blackened. Your property would be confiscated, leaving your family destitute. And most cruelly, to prove the sincerity of your confession, you had to name your accomplices. You had to name other witches. You had to point a finger at your friends, your family, your neighbors, and feed them into the very same infernal machine you had just barely escaped. It was a diabolical system that transformed victims into perpetrators, forcing them to validate the court's madness and perpetuate the cycle of accusation. If anyone could survive this madness through sheer force of character and reputation, it should have been Rebecca Nurse. A 71-year-old grandmother, frail and hard of hearing, she was famed throughout the community for her piety and kindness. When she was accused, it sent a shockwave through Salem. She was the matriarch of a large and respected family. 39 of the most prominent members of the community signed a petition attesting to her good character, an act of incredible bravery in the climate of fear. At her trial, she stood with a quiet dignity that unnerved even the magistrates. She answered their questions calmly and rationally. When the afflicted girls began their customary fits and shrieks, she looked upon them not with anger, but with pity. "What sin hath God found out in me unrepented of," she wondered aloud, "that he should lay such an affliction upon me in my old age?" The evidence against her was entirely spectral. The jury, perhaps moved by her character and the petition in her favor, returned a stunning verdict: not guilty. The courtroom erupted. The afflicted girls howled in protest. The assembled crowd roared with anger. William Stoughton's face was a mask of cold fury. This was not the verdict he wanted. He turned to the jury and publicly admonished them, questioning their reasoning. He pointed to a phrase Nurse had used during the trial when she referred to another confessed witch as one of our company. Stockton claimed this was a Freudian slip, a subconscious admission that she, too, was part of the company of witches. He sent the jury back to reconsider their verdict. The message was clear: find her guilty, or you, too, might face scrutiny. Intimidated and confused, the foreman returned minutes later. They had changed their verdict. Rebecca Nurse was now guilty. Despite a public outcry and even the governor's brief reprieve, Stockton insisted the sentence be carried out. On July 19th, the elderly, pious Rebecca Nurse was hanged on Gallows Hill, a martyr to a court that valued conformity over justice and accusation over evidence. Her death proved a terrifying truth: no one was safe. Piety, good character, a lifetime of good deeds, none of it mattered. If the afflicted girls named you and William Stoughton wanted you dead, you would die. The inferno was now burning out of control. But a fire, once it rages out of control, does not care who it burns. And the accusations, once whispered only against outcasts and the powerless, were now being leveled against the untouchable. The wife of a prominent minister, wealthy merchants, and then the ultimate blasphemy, the wife of Governor William Phips himself. Suddenly, the witch hunt was no longer a convenient tool for purging the community's undesirables. It was a loaded pistol pointed directly at the heart of the Massachusetts elite. This was the beginning of the end. In October 1692, Governor Phips, likely motivated more by self-preservation than a sudden crisis of conscience, finally intervened. He ordered a halt to the arrests, forbade the use of spectral evidence, and dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. The legal engine of death, which had ground relentlessly for months, was finally shut down. At the same time, the intellectual foundations of the trials began to crumble under scrutiny from Boston's educated elite. Respected ministers like Increase Mather, who had once cautiously supported the proceedings, now openly condemned them. He argued that the court's reliance on the ghostly testimony of the afflicted was a demonic deception, a trap set by Satan himself. It were better, he wrote, in a phrase that would echo through legal history, that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. The spell was breaking. The fever of hysteria gave way to the cold, sickening chill of remorse. What followed was not celebration, but a slow, agonizing reckoning with what had been done. One by one, the pillars of the prosecution began to crumble under the weight of their own guilt. In 1697, Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the men who had sent the innocent to their deaths, stood silently before his congregation at Boston's Old South Church. He handed a written confession to the minister and remained standing, head bowed in shame, as it was read aloud to the stunned crowd. He accepted the full blame and shame for the tragedy, praying for God's forgiveness for his part in shedding innocent blood. Years later, in 1706, one of the most notorious of the young accusers, Ann Putnam Jr., made her own public apology. She stood before the Salem Village Church and claimed she had not acted out of anger, malice, or ill will, but had been deluded by Satan into accusing innocent people. Imagine the scene: a young woman, now in her late 20s, facing the surviving family and friends of the very people her testimony had helped hang. The Massachusetts government tried to make amends, officially exonerating the victims in 1711 and offering financial compensation to their heirs. But how do you put a price on a murdered mother, on a reputation destroyed, on a community that had devoured its own soul? The payments were a pittance, a hollow gesture that could never wash away the stain. The screaming had stopped, but in its place was a silence more damning than any accusation. It was the silence of neighbors who could no longer look each other in the eye, the silence of a town forever defined by its darkest hour, haunted by the ghosts it had created itself. So what ignited the flames in Salem? It wasn't a single spark, but a toxic cocktail of fear and fanaticism. First was the suffocating grip of Puritan extremism, a worldview where the devil was a literal, ever-present threat, and any misfortune was evidence of his work. This festering fear needed a target, leading to the second ingredient, the scapegoating of social outcasts. Women, the poor, the indebted, and anyone who defied convention became the focus for the community's collective anxiety. Finally, this paranoia was legitimized by a catastrophic legal failure, the court's acceptance of spectral evidence. The testimony of accusers claiming to see the ghostly apparitions of the accused tormenting them was treated as undeniable proof, turning private nightmares into public death sentences. It's tempting to look back on this as a relic of a superstitious, unenlightened past. But the mechanics of the witch hunt are terrifyingly timeless. The poison of mass panic simply finds new vessels. Today, the village square is the internet, and accusations can spread across the globe in seconds, destroying lives and careers before a single fact is verified. The spectral evidence of our time is the unvetted rumor, the out-of-context video clip, the online mob that demands punishment without proof. Salem teaches us that when fear and certainty overwhelm reason, anyone can be branded a witch. The story of Salem, therefore, isn't just history, it's a permanent warning. It's a brutal reminder that due process, critical thinking, and the presumption of innocence are not abstract legal concepts. They are the fragile bulwark standing between civilization and the abyss of our own fear. If you believe these lessons from the past must never be forgotten, help us keep exploring them. Hit that like button and subscribe for more journeys into history's darkest corners. And I want to know what we should investigate next. Drop a comment below with a dark history topic that fascinates you. Let's continue to uncover these vital truths together.